everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. We are going to be talking about Chezkat Gimel Shanim, which is the third perek of Bava Batra, namely the notion that somebody who has lived on a piece of land for 3 years without any protest from the original owner can claim that that land belongs to her, even if the original owner says, no, it doesn't, I never sold it to you, right? As long as she claims, I bought it, the 3 years works in her favor. Now, this is a little bit of a head scratcher. It's a head scratcher from two perspectives, right? From one perspective, it's a head scratcher because it's like, wait a second, you have no shtar, you have no contract. And now we're just going to say, because you squatted here for 3 years without protest, that this this land is yours. It seems like, whoa, right? And then on the other hand, it's kind of a head scratcher in the other direction because when it comes to metaltalin, when it comes to portables, we actually think that holding, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? If I'm walking around holding a book, legally we assume it's mine. And if you want to take it out of my hands, even if you were the original owner of the book, you have to actually prove that it's not mine right now, right? It seems like the holding of something actually works pretty immediately, right? So this is sort of a head scratcher in a few different ways. And what I'd like to do, meaning, whereas here it takes 3 years for that muhsakut to do anything, right? So what I want to do is I want to look at 3 different perspectives on how Chezkat Gimel Shanim works, or really why Chezkat Gimel Shanim works, okay? And these 3 perspectives will actually take us around the globe, meaning around the Jewish medieval globe, essentially, to see some interesting, I would say, maybe some interesting mefarshim who you're not used to seeing, which I think could be really kind of fun, to be honest. I like when we can do things like that. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Share screen. Here we go. Okay. So we are looking at what is the concept behind Chezkat Gimel Shanim. So I want to start with the Ra'ah. And the Ra'ah is Rabbi Aaron Halevi. He's a 13th century scholar from Spain. And his opinion is anthologized in the Shita Mekubetzet, the Shita Mekubetzet being an anthology of Talmudic commentary from the 16th century by Reb Bitzal Ashkenazi. And here's what he says. He says, V'chazaka ein araya gemurahi. I just want you to know that this idea that 3 years works to establish ownership of the person who's been living there, it's not a complete raya, it's not a complete proof that this karka is theirs, right? Just because there was no protest on the part of the marakama, the original owner, over those 3 years, doesn't mean that it's a complete proof that it belongs to the person who's squatting there. Because milta de efsharhu de achle tlat shanim afagav delav didei. It is certainly possible that this squatter could go 3 years living on this land, even if it is not theirs, right? So why does Chezkat Gimel Shanim work if it's not a Raya Gemura? Why does it work to entail ownership on the part of the squatter? Ela dirabanan takun mishum delo mizdahir inish bishtare. The reason for the takana, which of course comes up as one of the versions of Rava's opinion on Daf Kaftet Amud Aleph, the reason why Chazal made this takana that 3 years of squatting without protest works is not because it's a sure thing that you really bought it, but because people just don't hold on to their shtarot for longer than 3 years. In other words, this is a public policy decision that Rabbanon were making. It's for the field. It actually says very little about the particular case in front of us. It's just that we don't want there to be a situation where if people aren't able to keep their shtarot, their business contract for more than 3 years, that suddenly you can be ma'arer, you can challenge the ownership of every piece of land, right? So this really tells us very little about the person who didn't protest, and it tells us very little about the person squatting. It tells us a lot about Chazal ensuring that we have good rules of thumb, like you don't need a contract after 3 years. Because if you did need a contract after 3 years of owning a piece of land, a lot of people wouldn't be able to prove their ownership over land. So they said, you know what, 3 years, Chezkat Gimel Shanim, that's it. So I love this opinion because it actually is less head scratching, to be honest, right? It's like it's a public policy decision. It doesn't prove anything. The fact that you squatted doesn't prove anything. The fact that they didn't protest doesn't quite prove anything. It's just smart public policy. But then there's another opinion, which is what we're talking about, the 3 years is actually a raya. It is actually some sort of pretty strong proof that the fact that there was no protest, the person continued to live there and use the land, that is a raya. Okay. And that's from Tosfot Harash. Now, the Tosfot Harash is written by the famous Rosh, Rav Asher ben Yechiel, in the 14th century. But what's interesting about him is that he moved from Germany to France to Spain. And the Tosfot Harash is his sort of redacted version of the Tosfot from Germany and France, and he brought it to Spain. So before Spanish Jews got their hands on full Tosfot, they got their hands on Tosfot Harash. So in the Tosfot Harash, he talks about Chezkat Gimel Shanim in very different terms. He says the Anan Sadeh, right? Anan Sadeh is sort of this like, we're all witnesses to the fact, meaning it's sort of, but we might call Chok Barzel, like it's like an ironclad rule. She'ein adam miniach karka biyad chavero shalosh shanim below macha im lo shemechara. We all know, we all are quote unquote witnesses to the fact, like the general fact of human nature and the way the world works, that a person would not allow somebody else to squat on their land without protesting for 3 years unless they actually sold it to that person, right? So this is very different. The Tosfot Harash is presenting a perspective that we're talking about. No, this is a proof. It is a proof. That's not a small thing that we went 3 years without a protest. That should have been enough time for the Marakama to show up. And then Tosfot Harash continues, Ki yadua l'kol, it's known to all, shetiknu chachamim dechezkat shalosh shanim omedet b'makom shtar. Everybody knows that Chezkat Gimel Shanim, this rule of 3 years of squatting without protest, makes it clear that it belongs to the person who's squatting there. That is in the place of a contract. Ki ein adam yachol lishmor shtaro le'olam. A person cannot hold on to their contract forever. V'gam tiknu kinegda, and correspondingly, Chazal also made a takana, she'amacha mevatelet hachazaka hecha shemachzik ba begezel. Right, that the protest will nullify the chazaka if this is indeed a case of theft, right? Meaning what he's basically saying is it's as ironclad as a shtar, right? It's as ironclad as a shtar. And when I look at that, I say to myself, well, this is very interesting because, what I mentioned at the beginning, that when it comes to metaltalin, when it comes to portables, we actually take physical holding, right? Possession is 9/10 of the law. We take it very seriously, right? But when it comes to karka, this opinion that it's really a raya, it's really a proof, it takes 3 years to get to that proof. Perhaps because the chazaka of the marakama, the ownership of the marakama, of the original owner, actually is incredibly strong, right? When we're talking about a book, we're talking about a metaltalin, my name is not so attached to my portable items. But when we're talking about karka, my name is very attached to my karka. And in fact, that is what part of what makes my marakama status so much more significant. And in order to prove that it's been broken, you have to prove that I willingly, as the mocheret, as it were, that I willingly let you do this, right? Possession is not 9/10 of the law here. It's actually, we're trying to figure out the psyche of the potential of the marakama. Did they actually want to give this thing away, right? So if this is the case, or sell it for them, if this is the case, this is very different from what we saw in the Ra'ah, right? The Ra'ah was, this is a public policy thing. It tells you very little. It doesn't give you a real proof, right? It's a public policy idea. People can't hold their shtarot for more than 3 years. That's unreasonable to expect. So therefore, we come up with this rule of thumb. If it's been 3 years, no protest by Marakama, let it be, right? Whoever's living there is living there. Tosfot Arash say, no, we actually, the Marakama matters very, very much. And the fact that the Marakama matters so much means we need a raya brura. We need a clear raya. We need a clear as shtar situation. And that's going to take us 3 years, right? Great. There is a third approach. And the third approach is no, 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 no. We're not talking about this being public policy. We're not talking about this being just a raya. What we're talking about is staying there for 3 years, living there is a kinyan. It's not proof that it was sold. It is the kinyan. And you actually see that in Rav Hai Gaon. Okay, so Rav Hai Gaon, also known as Rav Hai ben Shrira, and I actually have to just close this for a minute so that I can get it a little lower. Okay. I see it's on 112%. That's our problem. Okay, so Rav Hai Gaon, he is the last of the Gaonim. He's a Gaon from Pumbedita, Rav Hai ben Shrira Gaon, 10th, 11th century. I told you we were going to go to lots of different places. We've been to France and Germany, and we've been to Spain, and now we're going to Iraq, I suppose. Okay, so Rav Hai Gaon, he says in his Sefer Mekach Umemkar, listen to what he does. He compares 2 types of chazaka when it comes to karka. So one type of chazaka we seem to be talking about here, Chezkat Gimel Shanim. But another type of chazaka is a situation where somebody who's buying goes over to a piece of land in front of the marakama, in front of the one who owns it. And what do? They make some physical change in the karka, right? So they might, fence something in. They might lock a door. They might break through something, right? Something that shows their ownership and authority over it. So Rav Hai Gaon is actually going to compare this type of chazaka, because it's also called a chazaka, to Chezkat Gimel Shanim, in that both of them actually effectuate the kinyan, okay? Effectuate the acquisition. So here's how it goes. The chazaka zone, the concept of chazaka, when it comes to karka, mitchaleket lishnei panim. It can be broken down into 2 different versions. Yesh chazaka she'ein adam koneh et hakarka ela b'shalosh shanim. Right? There is one chazaka that a person takes 3 years to acquire a piece of land. Right? This is interesting. It's a raya. He says it's an acquisition. The 3 years is the acquisition. Okay? A person can only acquire land in 3 years. V'zohi chazaka sheyesh imataina. And that chazaka is a chazaka where there's a litigation claim, right? The person who's there, living there for 3 years and using it, has a claim, machartia, you sold it to me. And the other person says, lo machartia, right? Or kanitiha and lo kanita, right? Macharta velo macharti. Sorry. Right? A little whatever, right? Meaning one side says, I bought it. The other side said, no, you didn't. Okay. Kigon, for example, shemocher omer lo macharti. For instance, a situation where the potential seller of the karka says, I didn't sell this. And Lokech says, I did buy it. So in that case, sarich sheyavi lokeach raya, the buyer has to bring proof she'achala shalosh shanim, that they were on this land using it for 3 years, right? So it's not that being on the land for 3 years is the raya. It's you have to bring a raya that you were on the land for 3 years because that is the kinyan of the karka, right? And then vitana tamocher einatana. Then the claim of the would-be salesperson, or here we do say they're the salesperson, the marakama is not counted, right? So that's one kind of chazaka. Aval, but a chazaka shehi bertzon shnehem, but a chazaka that is by the will of both of them and doesn't require litigation. Shezeh mocher v'zeh lokeach ve'ein taina b'neihem. This one sells and this one buys, and there's no claim among them of, oh, lo macharti, and the other one says lakachti. And what is it? She'im na'al v'gider. I don't know if it's pirates like PL, or if it's parats like kal. Okay, bifanav, that if a person locked a door on that karka, or put up a fence, or broke through a fence in front of the marakama, kolshu, any amount, ulachar miken rotzeh echad mehem lachzor lav kol kamine. And afterwards they want to renege one of them, they can't unilaterally renege. In other words, there's two types of chazaka. One type of chazaka is Chezkat gimel shanim, where it takes 3 years to acquire, right? And that's a situation where there's a taina because they disagree with each other about what happened. And the other kind of chazaka is where they both agree what they're going through. One is selling, one is buying. And that is just, you make some, gesture of ownership on the place. So here, the way that Rav Hai Gaon is talking about this is he's talking about this as a real kinyan, right? And this I find to be really interesting as well, right? If the raya position tells us it's actually really, really important, that it's really, really important that the mocher didn't protest. And so it takes us 3 years to make sure that the mocher really wants this. And then it's a raya brura because they didn't protest. This idea that it's a kinyan actually puts a lot more power in the kona or the kona, the lokeach or the lokachat. It puts a lot more power in the hands of the squatter, right? It actually reminds me a little bit of, it's a little bit similar to metaltalin. Yeah, I have to hold it for longer, but it's still the fact that I'm holding it for a long time makes a big difference, right? Like the idea that this is a kinyan. It's not just a raya that the mocher was willing to get. It is a kinyan. Living on this land for 3 years makes me the owner. And it's really interesting to consider these three approaches of, is it public policy, or is it proof that the original owner really sold it? Or is it actually constitutive of the new owner acquiring it by living on it? It seems to me that when you look at the beginning of the third perek and you have different explanations as to how do we know that Chezkat Gimel Shanim works, what's the makor, what's the proof for it, whether from psukim or from logic, I think it's interesting to consider that perhaps the explanation that says that it's based on the shor muad, that it's based on just like 3 times an animal that gores, it moves from a tam to a muad. That to me, that comparison sounds very much like what you're saying is these 3 years actually transform the relationship of the person living there to the land. It's a real kinyan, the same way a shore that gores 3 times actually becomes muad. It's transformed, right? It is transformed. And then when I look at the explanations, whether it's from Yirmiyahu, when it seems like when he buys the sadeh at Anatot, right? When he buys the sadeh, when the Jewish people are about to be exiled from the land and tells people to buy, and says to them, oh, I want you to hold on to your shtarot. I want you to hold on to your contracts because they only have 2 years of living on the land. They're not going to have 3 years of living on the land. Sounds to me that what we're talking about is a little bit more in the zone of raya, a little bit more in the zone of you 3 years would have been a proof, but without 3 years, you don't have that proof, right? Then you go to all these explanations of Rava, right? Is it that, you know, the first year the Marakama would be Mochel, and the second year the Marakama would be Mochel, and the third year the Marakama wouldn't be Mochel. And so what we see here is maybe a Raya. Is it the first year the Marakama wouldn't be Makpid, the second year they wouldn't be Makpid, the third year they wouldn't be Makpid? Also, a little bit more in the Raya camp, I think. And then you have this explanation of, well, the first year people hold on to their shtarot, the second year people don't hold on to their shtarot, and the third year people, the second year people hold on to their shtarot, and the third year they don't hold on to their shtarot anymore. That to me sounds like the public policy answer, right? Now, of course, you could probably fetch it out so that each one could sound like something else, but just in terms of the impression that you get, right? Are we talking about the 3 years constitute the acquisition, they affect a transformation and the relationship between the lokachat and the land, or the squatter who's now the owner and the land? Is this a situation where we need a raya that the original mocher or mocheret really wanted to give this over? And in such a case, maybe this stuff with Yirmiyahu and maybe this question of whether the owner is mochelet or the owner is makpidan, all that, that's where it really matters. Or are we talking about public policy where really we're saying people just don't hold on to their shtarah, right? So I think it's really just kind of intriguing from a conceptual standpoint that we don't exactly know what's behind Chezkat Gimel Shanim, but it is certainly intriguing. And I originally read something by Rabbi Shmuel Shimoni. I think his name is Shmuel. I'm going to double check because I want to get that right. Rabbi Shmuel Shimoni, who actually he pointed out, and I thought it was very useful and helpful. He did point out the difference between the way that we treat karka, that we care so much about the marakama, and that we don't care so much about physical land holding, right? As distinct from metaltlin. But I do actually think that that mostly works based on the raya perspective, right? Like if it's just a raya, then what we're really saying is we care so much about the marakama, we have to give it 3 years so that it's clear. And the fact that you've been holding this for a long time, the holding is actually not what it's about. It's actually the lack of protest. Whereas I think if you go with the public policy perspective, it actually tells you very little about the difference between metaltlin and karka. And I think if you go with the kinyan perspective, that it's actually effectuating a kinyan, you basically say like, okay, so karka has different rules of what it means to have possession being 9/10 of the law. It takes a longer time to establish possession, right? Or not just establish, but to actually engage possession. But I'm not, I can't say, to me, to be honest, like I think the Raya explanation makes the most sense because of our focus on the protesters. But I want to look at a Tosfot because I think it's really nice to see sometimes when these two different, like the classic difference or the chakira that people would make would not include this public policy piece that I put in here because it would not include this public policy piece of it's just because people lose their shtarot, because to be honest, that doesn't tell you anything about kinyan karka. It doesn't, right? Like it's not a strong chakira. The chakira is usually between, are we talking about this is a raya that the mocheret was mocheret, or is this a kinyan that the lokachat is making right now? That's usually the chakira that's made. So I want to show you a Tosfot where that chakira seems to come to the fore because it's really, it's like when you start, when you see it, you see it. So let's take a look. 1 second. Second. We're going to go back. We're going to share our screen again. Okay. Okay. So take a look at this. This is really fun. So Tosfot and Bava Metzia, right? We got to always, take ourselves back. Tosfot and Bava Metzia are talking about the fact that, it's kind of interesting. We know that even though without the protest on the part of the Marakama, the squatter is now ne'emenet to say, I own this, right? However, it's actually the case, it seems, in the Gemara that the Marakama can say, yes, I gave it to her, the squatter, but I gave it to her as a mashkanta, meaning I gave it to her as like pledged property. And when I was going to pay her back the money that I owed her, she was supposed to give it back to me. Or I did let her live in this place, but I only let her live in this place to use the perek, not to own the property. Now, I would actually be ne'emenet as the marakama to say that, right? Or the martakama, I suppose. So Tosfot ask a great question. They basically say, okay, so 1 second, you're telling me that if the squatter comes with a taina after 3 years, right? Lakachti, I bought it. And the Marakama says, Lo macharti, I didn't sell it. Why don't we believe the Marakama? After all, the Marakama could have made a better taina that would have gotten her more stuff. Like she could have said, oh, yeah, of course I gave it to you, but it was a pledge on a loan. And as soon as I paid you the loan back, you were supposed to give it back to me. And we'd believe her. Or she could have said, yeah, I let you live here, but I let you live here just to use the perek. And we would have believed her. So why don't we believe her now when she says, I didn't sell it? I mean, isn't this the classic migo, right? We believe somebody when they make a taina that doesn't help them so much because they could have made a taina that would help them more, right? So why don't we believe her? Why don't we believe that Marta come? So that's Tosfot's question. And you'll see in the answers, you'll see. So it goes like this. Why aren't we always believing the original owner of the karka to say that this was gezel, this was theft? Based on amigo, based on the fact that the owner of the land could have said, the original owner could have said, yeah, I gave this to you as a pledge for a loan, and you're supposed to give it back when I give you back the loan, when I pay you back the loan, or I put you here so that you could use the payroll. The yesh lomar, so Tosfot is going to have two answers, right? One answer is going to indicate that this 3 years is a raya, and the other answer is going to indicate that the 3 years is a kinya. Take a look. The yesh lomar to have a migo b'makom edim. Well, maybe the reason we don't believe the original owner when she says, no, I didn't sell this to you, even though she could have said something that was better for her, like, I gave this to you just as a pledge on a loan. Nah, it's migo b'makom edim. We don't say migo b'makom edim. If there is no migo, if there are already edim to part of what the person making the claim is trying to say. Because here, the anan sade, we all know, im haya ba begezel, lo hava shatik, ela hayamocha. We all know that if this was theft, the original owner wouldn't have been quiet. They would have protested, meaning they're already aiding as if on the idea. The 3 years that went by with no protest from the Marakama, that's like Eidut. And we don't say amigo where there are Eidim that are already incriminating. So, of course, there aren't literal Eidim. But what it's basically saying is the 3 years living there without protest, that's a raya, right? It's a raya. And you don't say amigo when you have a very clear legal proof, right? So that's one perspective. Another answer, inami, another reason why we might not believe the original owner, even though she could have made a better taina. Chashiv migo lahotzi. Maybe it's considered a different kind of invalid migo, at least according to some Rishonim, or many Rishonim. Actually, I don't know how many and how many. But maybe it's a different kind of invalidated migo, which is called a migo lahotzi. Kevan she'achala shnei chazaka. Because the person has lived there already for 3 years, this would be a migo that we would be using to take something extract something financially from the current owner. Who's the current owner? The squatter. In general, we say migo in order to get somebody not to have to pay what we're trying to get them to pay. But do we use amigo to extract money from the other litigant? No. So here too, again, machlokes rishonim. Here too, back to 3 years have already gone by, means the person who we were talking about as a squatter until 5 days ago is actually the owner. And we're not going to use amigo to believe the Murakama to take this land out of the possession of the person living it right now. What does that tell you? It tells you the 3 years was the kinyan. It was the acquisition. It now belongs to the person who's sitting there, right? So these are two different perspectives. What I hope this did is I hope it gave you a nice sort of eye in the sky view for the third perek of the different possibilities of what Chezkat Gimel Shanim tells us about karka. Does it tell us something about the public policy of karka being something different from the public policy of metaltlin? Does it tell us something about the relationship of the original Murakama owner being stronger than in a situation of metaltlin, which is why it takes so long? Does it tell us something about, well, this is just a different version of possession as 9/10 of the law. In the case of metaltlin, it's immediate, whereas in the case of karka, at least where it's contested, it takes 3 years, but it itself is a kinyan. Enjoy your learning. See you next week.